Good morning. My name is Paul Walker, and hey. I'm part of the pastoral team here at the meeting place, but more importantly, I'm a dad of two very busy toddlers. Boy, are they busy. Something I find myself doing as a dad quite a bit is actually telling stories. I tell all sorts of stories about pigs, stories about cars and fast cars, stories about dinosaurs. And today I want to actually start our teach time today by telling you a story. So gather around, children. Here we go. Once upon a time, long, long ago, in a far-off land, there was a scorpion. And that scorpion needed to cross a fast-flowing river. He knew he would never be able to cross that river himself. It was far too dangerous. But up the bank of the river, the scorpion saw a fox emerge from the forest. The scorpion walks up to the fox and asks him, "Mr. Fox, I need to get across the river, but I can't swim. Can I please catch a ride on your back across the river?" The fox stared at the scorpion in amazement. "No, thank you, Mr. Scorpion. If I take you across the river on my back, you will surely sting me." The scorpion assured the fox, "I would never sting you. If I did that, we'd both drown." So the fox thinks about it for a moment. And then finally he agrees to take the scorpion on his back as he swims across the river. But halfway across the river, the fox feels an intense pain in his back. The scorpion had stung him. As the poison began to take effect on the fox, he could barely keep above water. He felt himself slowing down, and so the fox cries out, "You fool! Why did you sting me? Now we're both gonna die." The scorpion replied, "Couldn't help myself. It's in my nature." Have you ever found yourself wanting to do one thing, but inevitably you just keep doing the other thing? Have you ever wondered why you keep walking through the same thing over and over again? Have you ever noticed that the good you ought to do, you don't do, and that bad thing you're just trying to avoid, well, you can't help but do it? Well, for many of us, this describes our habits and our practices around spending on stuff. We may try to be disciplined. We may even set a budget. But at some point, after the last impulse buy, we find ourselves saying, "I can't help myself. It's in my nature." And so we find ourselves spending and overspending. We get caught in the cycle of more and more and more, spend, spend, spend. You know, they say the average Canadian has twice as much stuff in their house as compared to 50 years ago, which kind of makes sense because 50 years ago, your house was only a third of the size it is today. I mean, the average Canadian home, our houses are triple the size they used to be. So we spend, but maybe you're like me. Maybe you don't own a big house, but your phone is full and bloated of all these digital purchases. Like you blow money on like Farmville or something crazy like that. Any Farmville fans here? I see that hand. Thank you. I'm spending. You're spending. It seems we're all spending. And don't get me wrong, it's okay to have a house. It's okay to go on vacation. It's okay to buy things online. But the problem we're addressing today in this Challenge Accepted series is that many of us have not yet discovered healthy rhythms and boundaries to our spending. And worse yet, some of you are actually trying to spend out of your relational tensions. You get stressed and you find yourself going for a little retail therapy. I'll just treat myself. And we never get to the root of the problem. Of course, spending and chasing the unsatisfying rush of temporary material gains is creating all sorts of problems for us. I mean, we have debt problems. Canadians now collectively carry more consumer debt than at any time in our history. And to add to debt problems, we have record levels of stress. Again, Canadians are now, we're more medicated than we ever have been before. We're more statistically anxious than we ever have before in our history. And to add to all of this, our consumerism and constant more and more is contributing to the environmental degradation of this planet. They say, if we were to actually keep up our current levels of spending and consuming, we'd need 3 planet Earths. So why is it? Why do we find ourselves in this cycle? Why are we so addicted to spending on stuff? Why is it that we find ourselves fighting against our urges just to even stay on budget? Why is it that even when we know the downsides to overspending, we can't stop it? It's like it's in our nature. Well, let me suggest that the accumulation of stuff that's constant filling our houses with stuff, and it's a symptom of a problem, but it's not the problem itself. The actual problem is much, much deeper. It goes to the core of your being. So we could say that, these behavioral issues we all notice are actually just manifestations of our heart issues. See, I believe that God created us humans with desires and longings. I think we all have a longing for safety and security. I think we all have the longing to be loved and in relationship with others. And most of all, I think all of us here this morning have a deep longing for purpose and meaning. As the writer of Ecclesiastes puts it, it says, "You, O Lord, have set eternity in the human heart." Or as a far more modern poet puts it, everybody's got a hungry heart. The boss, yeah. I wish you would come to Winnipeg. You guys? No? Yeah. Well, these longings and desires, these hungry hearts that we have, it's good and it's needed. I mean, we need to have a bit of motivation to get up in the morning to provide for our families. But here's the thing. All our longings have this ability to get sidetracked, to become disordered and broken. And this is one of the big themes Scripture teaches us, that the effects of sin and brokenness are wide-reaching, that our hungry hearts are capable of consuming the good and the bad. And when we consume the bad, it's kind of like consuming salt water to solve your thirst. Church, this morning you should know this, that God set eternity in the hearts of humanity. And only that which is eternal can satisfy our true longings for purpose and meaning. Only when we learn to worship the Creator and not creation will we find contentment. St. Augustine puts it like this in his writing his book, Confessions. It's one of my favorite quotes. I think this just sums it up so well. He says, "You've made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." Our hearts are restless until they rest in God. So, how are we going to break our addictions to stuff? How are we going to rest our restless hearts? The answer to this morning, I think, is going to be found in Luke 12 here. And we're going to start at verse 13. If you need a Bible, we have some in the back, and if you're up in the balcony, some on the side there, go ahead, grab a Bible. Make sure I'm not making this up. But in verse 13, we read this. Someone in the crowd said to him, that's Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So Jesus here is in a crowd with many thousands of people, and he's teaching and engaging with the Pharisees and the experts of the law. Someone from the crowd just yells out at Jesus, "Yo, Jesus, help me out. Help me out. My brother's not dividing the inheritance with me." And this is actually a common thing for rabbis to do. I mean, rabbis were often called to arbitrate between disputes. And the dispute here in this verse is actually a pretty tricky one, Because in Jewish culture, the majority of the inheritance, what your parents left for you, the land and all of that, well, it went to the firstborn, about half of it. And then all the other siblings had to divide the other half amongst themselves. So it's a very tense situation. But listen to Jesus' reply here to the man. He says, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" And then he said to them, speaking to the crowd, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." Now notice that Jesus' response here, when he's put on the spot, is actually not to enter into the dispute. He refuses to engage the discussion. And rather what he does is address the crowd and warn them about greed. What's greed? Well, greed is that insatiable desire for more, often at the expense of everything else in our lives. Greed is when you take a good thing like money and possessions and you just use it to the excess. Now, it could be that the young man or the man that asked Jesus to arbitrate here was motivated by greed. He might have been a younger sibling who wanted to leverage the authority of Jesus to get what he wanted. We just don't know. The text doesn't tell us. But all we know is that Jesus is taking this very real life example to teach us an important lesson. And that lesson is this: watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Now notice that he's kind of describing greed like an enemy or a destructive force. I mean, he's using language like, watch out, be on guard. And it really does seem that from Jesus' perspective, greed is not a casual problem. It's not just something you kind of mostly ignore in your life. It's something you need to watch out for. Greed, it seems, is really an enemy of your heart. And in your life, know this: greed intends to do you harm. Now, I think the reason Jesus uses such harsh language towards greed is because he understands just how fragile we are. Jesus knows that greed can so easily overtake us. See, 50 years ago, many behavioral psychologists, when they were thinking about greed, they often thought about greed like a compulsion. It was like, if you're greedy, you're just kind of weak-willed, man up or something like that. I don't know what they said 50 years ago. But today we know through many, many studies that greed is much more like an addiction. It's much more like an addiction. Do you ever notice how excited you get when that Amazon order arrives to your house? Do you ever notice how good it feels to get a raise? Or how good it feels when you get a new car or a new outfit? Yeah, that's dopamine taking effect in your brain. And it's a good thing in moderation. When you acquire a new item, more money, a new job position, your brain actually releases a chemical, the dopamine. And without it, your motivation to do anything would be gone. But here's what happens. Your brain on greed is a scary thing. Your brain on greed takes the natural chemical release that's already hardwired into you, and it abuses it. Greed can become an addiction when you start to get all your satisfaction from gratifying the reward centers of your brain. And just like other addicts, our brain can start to chase a dopamine release. And even worse, our brain can build up a tolerance to this. So you start to need to take bigger and bigger acquisitions to get the kind of ego gratification that you require to feel good about yourself. So it's not enough to buy a new pair of pants. Your brain on greed says, I need an entire new outfit. It's not enough just to have any old car. Greed says, I need the fastest car that I can race in the streets. I know a bit about that. No, I don't. It's not enough to have a house. Greed says, I need the biggest and best house on the block. I got to keep up with the Joneses, right? And then you'll find yourself, trust me, you'll find yourself repeating this cycle over and over because you can never be satisfied. And I think most of you here know this. I think most of us know that material things cannot satisfy us. And if you have any doubt, there are many, many stories of people that have actually been wildly successful in their careers, and yet were left completely longing for purpose and meaning. This is the story of one of my favorite actors, Jim Carrey. And he made millions in Hollywood. He is the epitome of success. And this is what he writes in a recent interview. He says this: I think everyone should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of so they can see it's not the answer. Well, let's head back to Luke 12 here. Because Jesus then tells a parable which kind of anchors his teaching. And we're going to get into this in 1 second. But I want to highlight quickly the next thing Jesus says following the parable on greed. We read this: Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable are you than the birds? Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Now notice that Jesus says, therefore, which should always ask us whenever you read that in the Bible. You should ask, what's it there for? And what's it there for is that Jesus is connecting his warning about greed to worry. He commands us not to worry, to not be anxious. And I think the reason Jesus does this in this passage is that he knows that our addiction to stuff, our greed, can often be a form of just trying to solve our worries. Worry is a limiting belief. Worry is this form of fear that can keep you up all night. Worry is that danger bell that goes off in your head to warn you of possible threats. And I think some of the biggest threats are actually our feelings of not enough. And I think a lot of us walk through this. We may feel not pretty enough, not man enough, not social enough, not good enough, not smart enough. And when we worry, we spend. We spend. Spending on stuff can be a coping mechanism for our feelings of not enough. We can say to ourselves, if I just have this, then I'll be this. And in advertising, we call this the theory of fear appeal. And it basically goes like this. The advertiser knows that you have some fears. And so what they do is they try to sell you a product that addresses those fears. This happened to me when I was a teenage boy. One of my biggest fears, believe it or not, was that I would never get the girls. One of my fears. Woo! All right. And that's why I didn't get the girls, guys, right there. Because I'm so awkward. Right? So anyway, I'm afraid I'm not going to get the girls. But on TV, I learned that there's this product that if you slather your body in it, the girls will flock. It's called XFX. And so every day, I'd lather myself. Here's a news flash. The girls did not come flocking. They did not. There was no girls. Nope. What actually happened is that my fears and worries triggered me to spend. Is it any wonder that Jesus tells us not to worry? You're not yourself on worry. So let's dig into this parable Jesus has for us in Luke 12. It's just a short little parable. And here Jesus is giving us a diagnosis and a solution to our addictions to stuff. This is what we read starting in verse 16. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. So recap here. Got a farmer, and he has an abundant harvest. He's hit literal pay dirt. I mean, it's a ton of abundance that he has. I mean, he has enough abundance that he's run out of places to store his grain. Just think about that. I mean, in Jesus' day, you built a barn to last generations. And here, no generation has experienced this level of abundance. And it somehow makes enough economic sense that he can tear down his current barns, build new ones, and live off the excess. But let's keep reading. Here's what we read in verse 20. God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. So recap, God shows up and he says, by the way, buddy, you're gonna die. What's all this gonna be left for? And then Jesus closes the parable by reminding us to be rich towards God. So what does this mean? What is Jesus trying to say here? I think he's trying to say three things to us this morning to help us overcome our addiction to stuff. First thing I think Jesus is saying through this parable is, one, we need to think of others. We need to think of others. Notice that nowhere in this parable does the farmer ever mention a we context. It's a huge red flag in Jesus' culture, which was far more communal than us. Instead, what we see is a ton of personal pronouns. What shall I do? I have, I'll do, I'll say to myself, my barn, my grain, myself, my life, me, me, me. The farmer gives no thought about others, no thought about his community. He doesn't even mention his family. Instead, he just looks forward to living off the wealth. And I think here Jesus is pointing out to us that in greed, we can forget about God and we can forget about our neighbor. And we forget that failure to love our neighbor is failure to love God. We forget that our resources are not our own, but are given to us as good stewards. We forget that we are blessed to be a blessing. Second thing I think Jesus is teaching us here is that the abundance of possessions is foolish in light of our own mortality. I mean, God literally calls the farmer a fool. You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. And a fool in the biblical sense describes someone who either acts without God or acts without wisdom in a self-destructive way. And greed is foolish because you can't take it with you to the grave. Everything that you are worrying and trying to accumulate in your lives is not coming with you to the graveyard. It's going to stay there. The Apostle Paul, he puts it like this in 1 Timothy. He says, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. Last thing I think Jesus is saying to us this morning through this parable is that greed and worry are overcome through generosity. Remember, Jesus closes the parable with a warning. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. And here, Jesus is hinting at the antidote to greed, which is being rich or generous to God. Being generous. What does it mean to be generous towards God? Can you mail God a check? Does God take e-transfer? Does God have a bank account? I think he does. I think God does have a bank account. It just doesn't look like any bank account you've ever seen. Because God's bank account is the hungry that you give something to eat. God's business investment is the thirsty that you give something to drink. God's mutual fund is the stranger you invite into your house. God's stock portfolio is the naked person you clothe. God's RRSP is the sick person you look after. Like Jesus says to us in Matthew 25, truly, whatever you do for the least of these, you have done for me. So church, greed and worry are overcome through generosity. And I'm convinced of this because I know it's impossible to live in greed and to live in worry when generosity is your heart, when generosity is your outflow. Because generosity, I'm convinced, has this way of transforming our character, changing our focus. Rather than getting our rewards from acquiring tons of stuff, we get our rewards from honoring God and loving others. And this gets our eyes off ourselves. But perhaps the greatest thing generosity teaches us is contentment. Because you can't give it away until you decide what you can give away. This teaches you to set limits in your life. It teaches you to know where enough is so that you can be generous. So church, know today that stuff will never satisfy you. Know today that you cannot meet the longings of your heart with temporary things. That's only going to leave you miserable, dissatisfied, and longing for more. Because our hearts are restless until they find rest in God. Today, will you rest in God?
Paul, would you come on out? We've got some questions for you. And even as I've been talking, more questions have been coming in. So I'm going to go with one that was asked earlier already, and then I'll figure out what else has come in. Here's one. Our selfie culture tells us we're accumulating experiences the way our parents accumulated stuff. Mm-hmm. How do we deal with the desire to be seen, to be noticed, to be envied?
Ooh, yeah. Because with experience comes spending as well. I mean, to go on a vacation somewhere south, right? Like you're spending a good chunk of coin. If you're going out to, I don't know, a block party or something like that. Not ours. We're free, right? I think so. Yeah. So you're not going to spend money there. But they say like fun costs at least $8, right? And I think it can be really easy to have the experience side of us still drive us to spending. And a way to put some limits on that, I would suggest, is maybe communicate to your friends that are always trying to drag you out to the latest movie or the latest, let's go eat out. Just say, this is all I could do. I can go, once or twice a month. Pick which time. Kind of set boundaries there.
What about the envied part?
Ooh, the envy. Yeah. So you're looking at pictures of your great experiences or, your rockin' bod or something like that. Yeah, like our rockin' bod. And yeah, you could totally, we imitate each other's desires. That's what humans do. They say that children especially, that's the number one way of learning, is that they just imitate their parents. And so it's built into us to always imitate. So I think at some point we have to say, who am I imitating? Who am I? Who do I have my focus on? Is it Jesus? Do we find ourselves surrounding ourselves with a community of people that have healthy boundaries? They say you kind of become like your friends, eh? Yeah.
So here, I've got one here. My greed manifests in me hogging my own time. I'm selfish with it. I watch too many movies and TV. Is that a result of the same heart issue, or is there something else going on?
I definitely think it could be a part of it. I don't want to speak to your situation. Maybe let's have a talk and chat about that, but I think it's totally possible that, we binge on Netflix because we don't have the motivation to do other things that would probably benefit us a bit more.
Here's one. You mentioned something about the environment. Say more about the environmental impact of our selfishness.
Yeah. So we have this planet, hey? And we can actually pollute it. We can actually contribute to its harm. We can do good for it. We can do harm to it. And I think when we're spending, we're having to draw more and more from the earth. And I think fundamental to a Christian worldview is that God gave us this earth, that we're supposed to take care of it, that we're supposed to steward it, that we should actually care about the environment. And be aware that your purchases have direct environmental consequences. So maybe a couple things you could do is you could maybe buy local. I know that's one thing you could try out. Maybe you don't need 2 cars. Maybe you could bike to work. I know I need to bike to work, hey? Like, gotta work on that rockin' bod, right?
I am not nodding or shaking my head right now.
Okay.
You can say that about yourself. I'm not saying that about you.
So I'm gonna bike to work, and then I'm gonna save the environment, and I'll look really good, yeah, at the end of the day.